And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too?
That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding.
In fact, that's part of the point. We're told that Jesus is constantly trying to hide his identity because he has to be careful about how he expresses himself, which, by the way, seems to raise a contradiction when you consider the fact that we're told that in at least John's Gospel, Jesus is going around willy-nilly calling himself God. Thank you. Or as we say in England, assalamu alaikum. I must apologize for the previous debate fiasco. David's right that most people don't know what happened. A lot of accusations thrown my way, but I suppose that is the essence of our debate this evening. People thinking they know a thing or two about a person without hearing it from their own mouth. To which effect, I was thinking about how to approach this, given that I didn't know which approach David was going to take. I woke up this morning in this fine resort, opposite Legoland, which means that there's a roller coaster just outside of my room, and being a bit jet-lagged, I woke up quite late to the most peaceful of noises, that is, the sound of children screaming for their lives. Hearing the sound of innocent children screaming for their lives, of course, reminded me to read the Old Testament, and I wanted to begin with a verse. That was too easy. I factored that into my time as well. I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily, and that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, or the psalmist is talking about, the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm, he says, I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that the people who believed in these two powers was talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you, that all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day past his crucifixion and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship and his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too, one day. If this is a claim to be Yahweh, then, well, lucky us, I suppose. Now, it's difficult to know where to take this because, of course, there is a third really important Christological claim in John's Gospel, which is in chapter 8. I think it might be relevant to talking about the understanding of ancient Jews, and we'll see where this goes. Of course, famously, in chapter 8, Jesus is talking about eternal life, and his Jewish opponents say to him, they challenge him and say, well, our father Abraham, he died. Are you saying you're greater than him? And Jesus replies, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, and he was glad. And they say, what, you're not even 50 years old, and Abraham has seen you? And he says, truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am.
Christians often say Jesus clearly claimed to be God, but the text is not that simple. In John 10, when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, his opponents accuse him of blasphemy. But Jesus does not say, yes, I am Yahweh. He answers by quoting Psalm 82, I said, you are gods. That weakens the Christian claim because Psalm 82 uses the word gods for beings who are not the one true God. Then in John 17, Jesus prays that his followers may be one with God in the same way. So if oneness proves Jesus is God, then the disciples become God too. The Christian reading depends on ignoring the context.
Why is that important? Two reasons. Firstly, he seems to claim pre-existence to Abraham, which is pretty significant, but also this invocation of the word I am, in Greek, ego eimi, which many people think is a callback to the divine name of God given to Moses in Exodus chapter 3:14. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses asks God, who shall I tell them has sent me? And God says, Eesha, Asher, Eesha, which means I am that I am who I am. So go and tell them that I am has sent you. It's interesting. But of course, the New Testament is not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And it's well known that the authors of the New Testament were using a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. This is something that was pointed out by J.R. Daniel Kirk, so I'm indebted to him for this. But if you read the Septuagint that the New Testament writers were using, and we have very good evidence to suggest that John as well is using the Septuagint, how is this verse rendered? Exodus chapter 3. God says to Moses, ego eimi ho on, which means something like, I am the one who is. So go and tell them, ho on has sent you. In other words, in the Greek version, ego eimi is just as it is typically used in Greek, a way of saying, I am. And it's used commonly like this. In John chapter 9, the blind man is healed by Jesus. He runs into town. They say, is this not the man who was born blind? And he says, ego eimi, it's me. When Jesus is asked by the woman at the well, or the woman at the well says, I'm expecting the Messiah to come, Jesus says, I am he. Ego eimi, once again. That is how it is often used. So in the Greek Septuagint, we have, I am ho on. I am the one who is. Go and tell them that ho on has sent you. In the Greek Septuagint, in other words, the abbreviation of the divine name is not ego eimi, it's ho on. And it's ego eimi that Jesus says. And in fact, Jesus says the words ego eimi 6 times in chapter 8 of John's Gospel. And yet this is the only time it seems to annoy anybody. Why is that? Well, maybe because it's got more to do with the fact that Jesus seems to be claiming eternality. But supposing for a moment that this really were an invocation of the divine name, I'm just willing to grant it. Let's say, okay, he was meaning to evoke this imagery of Exodus 3 by saying, I am. Here we have to understand, as David is quite right to point out, the cultural context of early Judaism. And there is a tradition in early Jewish texts, or at least texts of around the contemporary time to the Gospels, of endowing beings who are not Yahweh with Yahweh's name, and thereby enabling them to exert his authority as his representative on earth. David's already talked about the angel of Yahweh. And there is the suggestion that the angel of Yahweh is Jesus. That doesn't seem to make much sense to me. For a start, if you turn to Hebrews chapter 1, the very first verse says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. In these last days. If Jesus is the angel of the Lord, way back in Exodus, the story of the Exodus, why is it that Hebrews says he's only spoken to us through the Son in the last few days? Likewise, in Acts chapter 6, Stephen is recounting a history of the Jews. And in it he says that an angel spoke to Moses through the burning bush. Not Jesus, but a messenger of Yahweh. It's a little bit strange. But suppose we just accept that the angel of Yahweh is a bit difficult to unpack. Augustine himself, by the way, said that the angel is correctly termed an angel if we consider him himself, but equally correct, he is termed the Lord because God dwells in him. What does that mean? I think it's an invocation of the divine name. This is most elucidated for me when we turn to non-scriptural Jewish writings of around the same period. For example, in 3rd Enoch, Metatron is called the little Yahweh, invoking the divine name, and in fact to the extent that the Talmud warns Jews not to confuse Metatron with Yahweh, because that seems to be the implication of what he's saying. But he is in fact just invoking the name. The most important example of this for me is the Apocalypse of Abraham, written around the same time as the Gospels. A Jewish text which tells the story of Abraham, who hears the voice of God, and he's terrified and he hits the ground. And he hears the voice of God speaking to an angel. And he speaks to an angel saying, go Yahuel, that's the name of the angel, of the same name, through the mediation of my ineffable name, consecrate this man for me and strengthen him against his trembling. Through the mediation of my divine name, which he's given to the angel Yahuel. Yahuel, by the way, Yah and El. It is a substitute for the ineffable name of Yahweh, the writing of which is forbidden. And that's why he's called Yahuel. And in fact, at one point, God is himself addressed as Yahuel in this text. Abraham is told by this angel Yahuel, stand up, Abraham, go without fear. Be right glad and rejoice, for I am with you. For eternal honor has been prepared for you by the Eternal One. I have appointed to be with you, and the generation prepared for you. So the angel, invoking the divine name, by the way, says to Abraham, rejoice, for I'm preparing for you, essentially, redemption, and it will come from your generation. And by the way, when Abraham finally stands up, one of the descriptions of Yahuel's appearance is that his hair is white like snow. Where have we heard that before? But interesting, isn't it? Let's think about the context of John 8:58. A lot of people forget that we're talking about Abraham. Why are we talking about Abraham? Why is it here that Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am? Well, if I'm right that he is just identifying himself and the thing that's important is the Abraham claim, could this stem from a similar tradition? This is what Andrew Perryman has suggested recently, that when he says, this whole thing gets kicked off because Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Well, hold on a second. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, the angel Yahuwah says to Abraham, rejoice, for from your generation will come one who will redeem you. So is it possible that a common tradition has Jesus referring to the fact that Abraham rejoiced to see his day because he was promised this redemption from the beginning of time? It's possible. It's a suggestion. I think it's quite an interesting one. But it is a little strange that Jesus claims to be pre-existent. He uses the present tense, I am. It's worth bearing in mind that the Bible sometimes does this when it is talking about plans that are preordained from the beginning of time. For example, in Revelation chapter 13, we hear about the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. It's talking about Jesus there. Jesus wasn't crucified at the beginning of the world, but it talks about it almost in the present tense, or at least as if it happened there and then. Why? Because the plan for this redemption through the Lamb was set in stone from the beginning of time. So it talks about it as if it's in the present tense. Similarly, famously in the book of Jeremiah, God says to the prophet Jeremiah, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. He also says, before you were born, I consecrated you as a prophet. How can you consecrate someone as a prophet who doesn't exist yet? That means that Jeremiah must be pre-existent, right? He must be, no, not necessarily. It just means that God had this plan. It's a poetic way of saying that God already knew what was going to happen and had planned this from the beginning of time. So putting all of this together, there is an interesting interpretation of Jesus saying that Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and the Jews not understanding him, not getting it. He says, look, before Abraham was, I am. I am the fulfillment that was promised to Abraham and was from the beginning of time, and here I am. Now, of course, this is all exegesis, and it's a little sort of spotty. But the most important question is probably about blasphemy. David mentioned blasphemy in a different context earlier. Why is it that they pick up stones to stone him to death? Because, of course, if I'm looking for a sound exegesis of correctly interpreting the words of Jesus, I turn to his Jewish opponents, who consistently throughout the Gospels are always understanding him correctly. No, the theme of the Gospels, especially John's Gospel, is how comprehensively the Jews misunderstand what Jesus is saying. When he says, I and the Father are one, they say, you're claiming to be God. And he said, no, you're not getting me. When he says that he forgives sins, and they say, who can forgive sins but God alone? He says, you're not understanding me. And hopefully we can get into that, actually. And here, of course, when they say, we're going to stone you, we're not told exactly what blasphemy they think he's committed. Do we now just think that they got it right, that they correctly understood what he was saying? I'm not so sure. Especially considering that if you look in Acts, again, I've already mentioned Acts 6, this is Stephen. Stephen is telling the story of the Jews to the Jewish authorities, who he's been brought before on charges of blasphemy. He's eventually stoned to death. Why? Because he has a vision. In Acts 7, filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Notice God, not the Father. Look, he said, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, the Jews cover their ears, run up to him and stone him to death. Notice the similarity, by the way, between this depiction, looking up and seeing the Son of Man sat at the right hand of God, or stood at the right hand of God in this case, and the claim that Jesus makes in his trial. It's quite interesting. Stephen is stoned to death for this. Did Stephen claim that Jesus was God here? Did Stephen claim that he was God here? Sometimes Christians act as if the only way to commit blasphemy is to claim to be God. That is simply not the case. In fact, in Acts chapter 6, we're told that Stephen has been fraudulently accused of blasphemy. They're making up charges against him. Here are the charges that they throw at him to bring him before the court for blasphemy. This man never stopped saying things against this holy place and the law. For we've heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses has handed on to us. Ladies and gentlemen, if changing the customs that Moses has handed on to us is enough to get somebody convicted of blasphemy, I'm not sure we should read too deeply into the accusations of blasphemy against Jesus. There's so much to say I've got everything I want to respond to. We have rebuttal periods, so if I haven't responded to everything David has said, hopefully I'll get the opportunity then. But this idea of the divine name being invested into people and them having the authority of God without being Yahweh themselves is, I think, the important ticket here. One slightly less biblical example is a story recorded by Josephus, which came to mind when David was speaking. When Alexander the Great approaches Jerusalem in an attempt to conquer it, the crisis is averted when a priest whose mitre bears the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, bears the name of God, comes out. And what does Alexander do? He bows down before the priest. Was Alexander bowing down before the priest, or was he bowing down to the divine name that was in him? When every knee will bow to Jesus, what is the context? Jesus has been given the name that is above all other names. Given it. This is a common theme. And so David's right that we need to understand how the early Jews were interpreting the various verses that we were reading, but I don't think it lends too nicely to his interpretation. Jesus is constantly talking as if he's not speaking with his own authority. He's doing this all the time. The most instructive example for me is in John 12:44, when Jesus cries out, "Whoever believes in me, believes not in me, but in the one who sent me." That's if you read the NRSV. The NIV adds in the word only. Whoever believes in me, believes not in me only, but in the one who sent me. That word simply isn't in the Greek. It's a little bit strange. I want to talk more about that. I want to talk about authority and where it comes from. I want to talk about the forgiving of sins. I want to talk about worship for sure. And whichever one of those roads we go down is essentially up to David Wood. But I'm ready for any of them, so we'll see what comes up. Thank you for listening.
Christian apologetics often depends on making one phrase carry more weight than it can hold. Before Abraham was, I am sounds powerful, but I am in Greek, ego eimi, is also used in ordinary ways, like in John 9 when the healed blind man simply says, I am he. Even in John 12:44, Jesus says, whoever believes in him does not believe in him, but in the one who sent him. That is not equality. That is agency. The Bible keeps showing Jesus as someone sent by God, speaking for God, and receiving authority from God. Christianity turns that into Jesus is God because the doctrine came first, then the verses were forced to fit.
All right, thank you, Alex. In my opening statement, I showed that in the first century, there was an interesting discussion within Judaism about the two powers in heaven. They had various ways of dealing with this. And we can see why when we read passages like Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So this is God saying to Abraham, take your son. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, is when he starts to do it. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So this is the angel of the Lord saying, you haven't withheld from me your only son. And it was God who ordered Abraham to do this. So we have situations like this, and I argue that Jesus enters the discussion when they're confused about the two powers in heaven and claims to be one of them. And so there we looked at what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, and what his enemies do. Alex seems to suggest that there could be some sort of angel or something like this, or even a person who's endowed with this kind of divine authority. I got problems with this even here in Genesis. So look at what this said. Then the Lord, Genesis 33, then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way. Who is accompanying them and guiding them? Well, the angel of the Lord. But here he says, I'm not going with you this time. So this is the Lord speaking. It's not the angel of the Lord, and you say, oh, this is the Lord. This is the Lord speaking. This is the Lord speaking, says, I'm not going up with you now, when it was the angel of the Lord who was accompanying them. So these are the sorts of things you have, and people tried to figure out how to deal with this. And they came up, again, with all sorts of ways, and Jesus entered the picture and claimed to be one of the two powers in heaven. So what Jesus says, we went through 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers. He's the divine Son of the Father, he's the Lord of King David, and he's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we saw how people reacted to him claiming to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. In response, Alex was he quoted Psalm 82, and then Jesus using this passage. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. And Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? So Jesus is sent into the world, according to this passage. Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? This is not, and I have no idea how you would ever read the Gospel of John like this, let alone anything else Jesus said. This is not Jesus saying, what, you're misunderstanding. I'm just a regular dude. Again, if this were the only verse in there, maybe, because given the rest of what we read in the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels, Jesus is not claiming to be a regular guy. He's using a legal technicality here that they should be aware of. They're saying, hey, here's what you're claiming. You're claiming to be the Son of God. This means you're claiming to be equal to God and so on, and therefore, this is blasphemy. And Jesus' response is, well, really? Well, in the Psalms, God calls people Elohim. Therefore, you can't just say calling someone some divine title is blasphemous and deserves a death sentence. You have to show that that the title is not from God, that it's not true, that it's false. Have you done that? No. Okay, you can't kill me. You can't just say there's a claim and therefore we will kill you over it. So that's a legal technicality. Again, if you're somehow reading this as, see, Jesus is just claiming to be a regular guy, wow. All right. So we have John 17:5. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. Why? Alex quoted John 17 to show that Jesus is just claiming some regular relationship that we can all have with God or something along those lines. What does Jesus say in the same chapter that Alex is quoting? And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding. So what Jesus does, we've looked at it. I think he said he's going to respond to it. So what does Jesus do? He's the judge. He's the final judge of all people, according to him. Again, the Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who's going to sit on his throne in judgment. Jesus said, yeah, that's me.
The Christian argument keeps making the same leap. If Jesus has authority, glory, or a special role, then he must be God. That does not follow. In the Bible, God gives authority to others all the time. Joseph is given Pharaoh's authority in Genesis 41. Moses is made like God to Pharaoh in Exodus 7:1. Angels speak for God without being God. Even John 17:5 says Jesus asks the Father to glorify him. He is receiving glory from someone greater. That is not one equal God talking to himself. That is a dependent figure being exalted. Christianity has to stretch the text because the Trinity is not clearly taught by Jesus.
The Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. The people in their graves are going to hear the voice of the Son of God. Now that is very strange if that's how we all are. We're all going to be raised from the dead by the Son of God. If that's him saying, oh, we're all just the same and we can all, you'll be in me and I'll be in you. Very strange way of putting things. What his friends say. Now, this is interesting. Alex quotes Stephen in Acts 7. Now, this is an awesome passage because this kind of proves everything I was saying in my opening statement. Look at this. So, Stephen rebukes the Jewish leaders in the harshest terms you can possibly rebuke someone. Watch what he says. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, and now you have betrayed and murdered him, you who have received the law that was given through angels but have not obeyed it. That is absolutely brutal. And guess what? They get mad, they don't get violent. Which what happens? When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven. Have they gotten violent yet? Looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man, remember that? The Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Oh, you got God and then just someone else. How many powers in heaven? When do they get upset? Watch when they get upset. I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. 2 powers in heaven, and Jesus is one of them. Now watch how they react. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. When do they get violent? When he says Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. That is the precise moment when they get violent. Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. So keep in mind, this actually supports me, right? I mean, this is one of the early Christians who gets stoned to death for saying that Jesus is one of the 2 powers in heaven. And if you're thinking he's just a regular guy hanging out in heaven, first of all, you might want to check about someone being in the presence of God and what sort of person you'd have to be. But look what he, oops, do I have it? Oh, I don't have it. Right after this is when Stephen, I don't have it on slide. Right after this is when Stephen looks up and says what? Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Is that just a regular guy in the presence of God up there? No, that's someone who receives the spirits of people. Is that a regular guy? So Alex thinks this is just God endowing someone with authority. Does not look like that. Jesus seems to be the authority here. And this not only gets Stephen killed, this sets Paul on a rampage. Paul says, I have to wipe this stuff out. Why? We're told in the book of Acts what really sets Paul off. When Ananias is told that Paul is coming, well, Saul back then, he says, he's been told to apprehend everyone who calls on this name. Why is that an issue, calling on the name? That's how you describe prayer in the Old Testament, calling on the name of Yahweh. And Paul sees the Christians calling on the name of Jesus the way they're supposed to call on the name of Yahweh. Why is this relevant? Paul converts to Christianity about 2 years after the crucifixion. When is this taking place? This is not something that happens 50 or 60 years after the time of Jesus. We have Christians calling on the name of Jesus as they call on the name of Yahweh, and we can trace it to within 2 years of Jesus' crucifixion. So if this is a misunderstanding, that's a pretty big misunderstanding, and Jesus must be the worst communicator of all time. Alex brings up the Septuagint responding to John. I didn't rely on the passages he's responding to. But if you want to go to the Septuagint in terms of interpreting the claims of the New Testament, let's go to Luke 6:46. Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? If you want to talk about the Septuagint, there's only one other place outside the Gospels where they use this Lord, Lord. That's the Septuagint. And it's a translation of Adonai Yahweh, God. Adonai Yahweh. So that's the Lord Yahweh. But in Greek, they would translate Adonai and Yahweh as Kurios. So it's Kurios, Kurios in the Septuagint. And here Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? And so if you want to interpret Jesus based on the Septuagint claiming to be Yahweh, here you go. There it is. And it's in the Gospel of Luke. So at the end of the day, the claim is that everything is just some sort of big misunderstanding. This is very, very, very strange to me, because you're basically saying Jesus was not a good communicator. You know, you think about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan and the golden rule and so on and so on and so on. Jesus seems like the best communicator of all time. He's careful about what he's saying, and sometimes he unveils things in different ways, but when he makes a point, it seems people get this point. If all of his followers just seem to misunderstand him and start worshiping him and praying to him, making doxologies for him and so on, putting their liturgy around him, then you're saying Jesus was just a terrible, terrible communicator. And that, I have to say, is the one option I cannot accept here.
Christians love to say people worshipped Jesus early, so Christianity must be true. That is weak evidence. Early belief does not equal accurate belief. People have worshipped emperors, angels, saints, and false prophets throughout history. In Acts 7, Stephen sees Jesus at the right hand of God, which actually shows separation. God is one figure, Jesus is beside him. Even Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:28 that the Son will be made subject to God. That is not equal power, that is hierarchy. Christianity takes devotion, prayer, and exalted language, then forces it into a later doctrine. Believers were building theology before they had clear evidence.
Rebuttal.
It gets a bit messy, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, because, of course, we're responding to each other at cross purposes. I respond to an opening, he responds to my opening. I sort of have to take it back a few paces, but I'll try to make it interesting. We heard about the angel of Yahweh and the suggestion that this might indeed just be Jesus. It might be. Look, I don't claim to be the sort of final authority on exegesis here. I'm simply asking you to consider what you think is a more appropriate explanation. I've suggested the divine name-bearing model as opposed to the two powers in heaven. And when I look at passages such as Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, see, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. I just ask which interpretation lends itself more nicely to the passages. David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude. That is far, far from the case, especially in John's Gospel, where Jesus seems to posit himself as something of a model of faith for his disciples. And for what it's worth, this is kind of the image that I get of Jesus reading through the Gospels. What is he supposed to be? Something like an idyllic, faithful servant of God, and certainly in a special position. If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking about Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know. That word grasped there, harpagmon, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it, he's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names. Again, which interpretation lends itself more nicely to these passages? For what it's worth, my favorite interpretation, I was discussing this the other night at dinner with, well, not with David actually, that would be giving too much away, but is this so-called Adamic. James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God. If we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems, Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized, not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2 that for a time Jesus is made lower than the angels, presumably while he's here on earth. Again, it just reads to me as if at least while on earth, Jesus is certainly not approximating Yahweh, but he's also not just some dude. David mentioned the glory that's given to Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 5, the same chapter that I was using. Yeah. Verse 5, Father, glorify me in the presence that I had with you before the world was created. Just keep reading John chapter 17 and see what Jesus wants to do with that glory. In fact, the very passage that I quoted, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray that all may be one, Father, just as you're in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, blah, blah, blah. Immediately afterwards, so they may be brought into complete unity. Then they will know, I've copied the wrong passage actually, Jesus says that the glory you've given me, I will give to them. In John chapter 17. He says, the glory you've given me, I will give to them, the disciples. We're told in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, that God shares his glory with nobody. And this is sometimes a suggestion that's made is sometimes that because Jesus says, glorify me, God, in John chapter 17, he must be God because God shares his glory with nobody. But people just seem to forget that in the same chapter, Jesus says that he will give the glory that he has been given by the Father to the disciples too. Again, all I'm asking you to consider is however you interpret these verses where Jesus is given glory, Jesus is given the judgment, and bear in mind that Jesus is given all of these things, what he then does with those things, and whether he delegates them to other people. Because if he does, then it's clearly not just something that can be delegated to God himself. Only God judges. Only God can judge, but Jesus says that he will judge. Jesus also promises judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So are the disciples God? Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins. In John chapter 20, verse 21, he says, as the Father has sent me, again, kathos, just as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. If you forgive people's sins, their sins will be forgiven. If you do not, their sins will be retained. I'm told that only God forgives sins, but then Jesus gives that ability to his disciples. In other words, all of these things which are supposed to indicate that Jesus has a special relationship with God, of course he does, but it's a relationship that he hopes and literally prays that will be shared with everybody. Also, this Luke chapter 6, verse 46 thing that David put up, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. As far as I understand, in Luke chapter 6, verse 46, when it quotes, Lord, Lord, and as far as I understand, David was saying that in the Hebrew, this is presumably Yahweh Adonai, right? Is that right, David?
I did not come.
Yahweh Adonai in the Hebrew. Perhaps he'll address it in his second rebuttal. And then said, but in the Greek Septuagint, this is translated as Kyrios, Kyrios, because it's Lord twice. Which translation of the Old Testament are the New Testament writers using? The Septuagint. So the passage that they read will have said Kyrios, Kyrios, Lord twice. It wouldn't have said Yahweh and then Adonai, or rather the other way around, I think it is. It would have said Kyrios, Kyrios. So, of course, they're willing to use this in Luke's gospel, because it says the same word twice, which to them just means Lord, because that's the translation that they're reading. Also, this idea that Jesus is a perfect communicator, David is like mocking this idea, saying, am I supposed to understand Jesus as just being a terrible communicator? Well, if you look at the way that the Jews were interpreting him, kind of. At the very least, people were deeply confused. Everybody was confused, not just his Jewish opponents because they were hardened of heart. His disciples regularly struggled with his teachings too, asking him to expand and explain what on earth he meant. It even says at one point that Jesus was speaking in parables so that, quoting a psalm again, they will be ever seeing, ever looking but not seeing, ever hearing but not understanding. The Gospels tell us that Jesus was speaking intentionally in such a way that people would misunderstand him. And then it says, but when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything.
Christianity keeps confusing borrowed authority with identity. Jesus is given glory, given judgment, and given a name above other names. That word matters. Given. Philippians 2 says God exalted him after his obedience. John 17 says Jesus gives his followers the glory he received. John 20 says he sends the disciples and gives them authority to forgive sins. So when Christians say, only God can do that, the Bible itself shows authority being passed down. Their argument collapses because Jesus is not presented as the source of power. He is presented as someone receiving it, using it, and sharing it.
So no, I don't actually think that Jesus' public ministry was entirely clear to everybody who was listening. In fact, that's part of the point. We're told that Jesus is constantly trying to hide his identity because he has to be careful about how he expresses himself, which, by the way, seems to raise a contradiction. When you consider the fact that we're told that in at least John's Gospel, Jesus is going around willy-nilly calling himself God, in the full view of his disciples and also his opponents, he invokes the divine name, and anybody listening would have completely understood what he was saying. And yet throughout the Synoptic Gospels, there is a motif, the messianic secret, so it's called, that every time he reveals his identity, he tells them not to tell anybody. Don't tell them I'm the Messiah. But it's fine for them to know that I'm God. I don't know about that. I think the best way of understanding who Jesus is, like I say, a sort of idyllic human being. Take when Jesus walks on the water, for example. Another example that's often given as a high Christological moment, because of course in Job 9 it says that only God treads upon the waves of the ocean. Sure, but people then also forget that Peter also walks on the water just afterwards. But Peter starts sinking, and Jesus says, you don't have enough faith. What does that imply? That if Peter had enough faith, he could have kept walking on the water. What are we to take from this? If Jesus is supposed to be God because he walks on the water, but then Peter walks on the water too, I don't think that's a very good interpretation. In other words, we're told that God forgives sins, but then the disciples are given the authority to forgive sins in John chapter 20. We're told only God walks on the water, but then Peter does this immediately afterwards. We're told that only God can have the authority to judge, as David says, but the disciples are promised judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel. That's not the only time that judgment is delegated, by the way. We're told that Jesus explicitly claims identity with God by saying he and the Father are one. But then Jesus prays that his disciples will be one in the same way. We're told that God will share his glory with nobody else, but Jesus claims to have had glory with the Father before he was born. But Jesus then says he wants to share that glory with the disciples. We're told that Jesus only rightly accepts worship. This is interesting, by the way. David flashed on a few passages of Jesus accepting worship in the Gospels. The word most commonly translated as worship in the New Testament is proskuneo, which means to bow down or prostrate before a higher authority. And of course, Jesus received this proskuneo worship, therefore he must be God. If that is the case, then we have to consider the fact that David, in the Septuagint, for example, bows down proskuneo before Esau, that Joseph's brothers proskuneo before him when he's governor of Egypt, that the entire nation of Israel offers proskuneo worship to King David as well, that Lot proskuneo before two angels. Proskuneo is littered throughout the Old and also the New Testament, by the way. In the parable of the unmerciful servant, when one of the servants returns, he offers proskuneo to his master. And this is a story that Jesus is saying. Also, let's not forget that in Revelation, Jesus promises that his true followers, their enemies, will proskuneo, worship before them. Jesus himself in Revelation is saying that human beings will receive proskuneo worship. If proskuneo worship is something that only God can receive, then all of these people sinned. All of them. The entire assembly of Israel sinned when they bowed down before David. I don't think that's a good interpretation. There is another word that's sometimes translated as worship, which is latruo. This is religious cultic worship that is only offered to God. Nowhere in the Gospels is this offered to Jesus. How many times is proskuneo worship, how many times is any kind of worship accepted by Jesus in Luke's Gospel? Does anybody know? 0. The word comes up 3 times. Twice in the temptation of the desert where it's discussed, and once at the end after Jesus has ascended so he can say nothing about it, and in a verse that's contested in our manuscript traditions. How many times in Mark does Jesus accept worship? This time the answer is 2, but one of those is the demon legion. It's usually translated as throws himself at his feet before Jesus. And the other is when the Roman soldiers mockingly worship Jesus. They offer proskuneo. Why? Because he's the king of the Jews. Because proskuneo worship is something offered to kings, higher authorities. I'll keep going perhaps in my further rebuttal, but if worship is something that is only due to God, then there are a lot more sinners in the Bible than we think. Okay, thanks.
All right, so now David Wood is going to do his second 6-minute rebuttal, and then that will be followed up by Alex's 6-minute rebuttal.
All right, Alex says we're looking for the best explanation. I would submit that the best explanation for Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers in heaven, and for claiming to do things like judge the world and raise the dead at the resurrection, and for why his followers are praying to him and worshiping him and calling him God and the Son of God and doing the same thing, doing the exact same thing that Jesus does, namely claiming to be one of the two powers in heaven, and for his enemies to repeatedly accuse him of blasphemy, ultimately sentence him to death, and then people who say the same thing, like Stephen, also find themselves being executed. I would say that the best explanation of that is Jesus was claiming to be God. That's just me. It's like if I met like suppose I never heard a word from Alex, but I meet like 5 of his biggest fans, and they say, yeah, we love Alex, he's the Messiah. And then I run into 5 of his harshest critics, and they say, man, we can't stand that dude Alex, he thinks he's the Messiah. Even if I never heard a word from Alex, I'd be thinking he was claiming to be something like that, and that's what's giving his friends and enemies that indication. Likewise with Jesus, even if I didn't have any words with Jesus, if I just knew these guys people were being put to death for making these kinds of claims, and that his followers are going around worshiping him and praying to him, I would think he's saying something. Now, Alex apparently thinks that the best explanation is this divine name-bearing scenario. If so, Jesus did a really terrible job of getting that message across, and it doesn't seem like anyone really got the point unless we do some creative interpretations of some passages. Alex again quotes Exodus to say that the angel of the Lord is just some representative who bears the name. Again, I quoted the exact same book he quoted where Yahweh says that I'm not going along with you anymore, which is Yahweh saying that he was the angel of the Lord who was guiding them. He says that his view is that Jesus is presented as the ideal servant of God. The ideal servant of God convinces people to bow down and worship him and pray to him and so on. This is what the ideal servant of God would do. That's a very strange ideal servant of God, since that's kind of precisely what you shouldn't do if you're not God. He says that proskuneo can mean bow down. Yes, the word proskuneo depends on the context. If it's a religious context, it refers to worship. Someone can just bow down to you out of respect, and that would be, you can bow down to a normal human. But guess what? We have clearly religious context in some of these passages. For instance, Matthew 14:33, they are freaked out. Those who are in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. It's a different sort of context than I want to ask you for a favor and I want to bow down out of respect. As for Philippians 2, it sounded like he was saying, Dunn's theory, that this is just saying that when it says who was in very nature God, it's actually the form of God, but this is just saying that he was a human being, and since he found himself as a human being, like we're all the image of God, he humbled himself, and therefore he was eventually exalted, and so on. It just doesn't work.
One of Christianity's weakest tricks is treating every bow as worship of God. In the New Testament, the word often translated as worship is proskuneo, which can simply mean bowing down before someone with authority. In the Old Testament, people bow before kings, rulers, and even angels. That does not make them God. The stronger word for religious service to God is latrio, and the Gospels do not show people offering that kind of worship to Jesus. So when Christians say, they worshipped Jesus, therefore Jesus is God, they are leaning on a translation shortcut, not a clean argument.
Let me just read it. Who being in very nature God, or you can just make up a translation and say image of God for fun. Who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Yes, that can mean seize. It can also mean used to his advantage. You look at what makes sense in context. did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. The decision to humble himself is what led to him being made in human likeness. This isn't a human being who's sitting around going, hey, I'm in the image of God. I could strive to be like God, like Adam did, but I'm going to humble myself instead. This is a divine being humbling himself by becoming a human being. And then, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him in the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Alex seems to think that if you're a human being and you humble yourself in this way, that God can just exalt you to the status of Yahweh and apply these passages that are just Yahweh when Yahweh says there's no one else but me. That's what's being quoted there from Isaiah. As for kurios, Alex says, well, what would they be using? They would be using the Septuagint, the Greek translation. Yeah, and they went to a passage, they used the formulation kurios, which is specifically referring to Yahweh. That's what Jesus uses. He's quoting kurios. He's calling himself kurios. The only other use of that is the Septuagint, where it refers to Adonai Yahweh. So why is Jesus using that? And again, I only brought up that point because he brought up the point about the Septuagint and using it to interpret the claims of Christ. So I said, fine, let's go with it. We got in Luke, and therefore that's him claiming to be Yahweh. Was Jesus a bad communicator? He says, but Jesus wasn't clear, and he veiled his statements. So yes, I grant all of that. Jesus was a careful communicator. He was careful about how he communicated certain things. He tried to unveil certain things over time when people were ready for it. That's not what I consider a bad communicator. I consider all of that part of being a very good communicator. If you're saying that the people who all heard Jesus all got it wrong somehow, or that we don't really have the records of the people who somehow got it right, that his friends got it wrong because they continue and they build their church around him, and his enemies are sentencing him to death, I would say that's a really, really, really bad communicator, and that just does not line up. If everyone is concluding the same thing about this guy, that he's claiming to be God, that he's claiming to be one of the two powers in heaven, the best explanation is not some idea that no one got. The best explanation is very simple. He was making those claims. That's why we have all this evidence.
All right. Check. Okay, so now Alex is going to do his second 6-minute rebuttal.
Okay, I suppose I really want to nail down on this worship point, since I was kind of getting at that at the end. And David says, yeah, proskuneo can mean just simply bowing down, but in a religious context, it means something else. Like, what do you mean? How do you know that without begging the question? Like I say, let's actually evaluate. That's what I was sort of going through, how many times proskuneo worship is given to Jesus in the New Testament. Or at least that Jesus accepts it in the New Testament. It doesn't happen once in Luke's Gospel. It basically doesn't happen once in Mark, because it happens twice, and one of these is a demon, and one of these, which I suppose is an interesting thing to explore in itself, but one of these is them simply mocking Jesus because he's the king. Why would they consider mocking him with proskuneo worship if he was claiming to be king of the Jews? Because that's what proskuneo means. If proskuneo can mean actually worship of the kind that latruo usually gets at, that is worship, cultic worship of a religious figure, as David suggests, here's a riddle for you. Why isn't it given to Jesus after Jesus ascends? Why isn't it that people are offering proskuneo worship after Jesus ascends, except at the moment of his ascension at the end of Luke's Gospel, which, as I say, is contested in our manuscript tradition anyway? Why not? Because it refers to a physical action. Because it's not referring to worship of the kind that David wants it to be in this context. In John's Gospel, which we didn't get to, how many times does Jesus accept worship? The answer again is once. Just once it happens in John chapter 9. This is the man who was born blind, who I mentioned earlier. In verse 38, he says to Jesus, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Except he doesn't say so in Papyrus 75, he doesn't say so in Codex Sinaiticus, he doesn't say so in Codex Washingtonianus. In other words, this verse isn't present in our earliest manuscripts. We're pretty confident that there are elements of the Gospels which are later interpolations, most famously the ending of Mark's Gospel, which is not in our earliest manuscripts, and the story of the adulterous woman, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, which are not in our early manuscripts. I'm interested as to whether David thinks that there are things in the Gospels which didn't actually happen, either because they're recorded incorrectly or because they are later interpolations. But at least in this case of worship, it seems to be a later interpolation. But at best, we've got one instance of Jesus accepting worship in John's Gospel, and our manuscript evidence seems to suggest that there's none. If worshipping Jesus is supposed to be some indication of his divinity, then why is it only Matthew's Gospel who seems to mention anything to do with worship and uses a term when there's another one available to indicate cultic religious worship to someone who's divine, yet he chooses a word which just means physical prostration before someone who has a higher authority, like, I don't know, maybe the Messiah? Like, the disciples bow down and worship Jesus. At what point do you think they began to get the picture that he was God? They knew that he was the Messiah for a long time, but I genuinely don't know when David thinks they began to realize that this person was God. Do you think there might be an instance of them offering proskuneo worship to Jesus before they'd fully realized that? I think so, because proskuneo worship is a physical action that's given to people who are of a higher authority. Just to belabor this point, in the Septuagint, here are some examples of proskuneo worship. Lot worships two angels in Genesis. Abraham worships the Hittites. Isaac blesses Jacob to have all the nations on earth worship him in Genesis. Jacob worships Esau. Joseph's brothers worship him. Abigail worships David's servants in 1 Samuel. Saul worships the dead Samuel in 1 Samuel. The sons of prophets worship Elijah in 2 Kings. David worships the temple in Psalm 5. All the people of Israel worship King David in 1 Chronicles. This is the same term, proskuneo. If David wants to suggest that sometimes this proskuneo worship can mean cultic religious worship, even though there's another word available that people use to mean that, but it's not being used in this instance for some reason, I want to know what that distinction is, and how we can know which kind of worship is being given without simply begging the question and saying that, well, when it's given to Jesus, it's obviously of the religious kind. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, this worship point is essentially bunk.
Christianity leans hard on verses that are not as solid as believers pretend. The claim that Jesus accepted divine worship falls apart when the key word can simply mean bowing before authority. Even worse, in John 9:38, where the healed man supposedly worships Jesus, that line is missing from important early manuscripts like Papyrus 75 and Codex Sinaiticus. That matters. If your proof that Jesus is God depends on a debated verse and a flexible Greek word, then the evidence is not strong. Christian doctrine keeps acting certain where the text is messy, late, and disputed. So what do you think? Did Jesus clearly claim to be God? Or did later Christians build that idea around him? Comment your answer below. And if you want more breakdowns like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.